Well, thanks everyone for joining today. Today I'm here to talk about woodland habitat management for white-tailed deer. Before I dive too far into it, a little bit about me. Born and raised near Farming, Minnesota, which is about 25 miles west of St. Cloud. Graduated from Minnesota State University Moorhead in 2015 with a degree in biology, and then graduated in 2018 from the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute at Texas A&M Kingsville with a master's in wildlife management. And then since then, I have had my consulting company, primarily working with private landowners to improve habitat on their land. So a little bit of wildlife 101 before we get into deer. There's kind of this basic core set of requirements that all wildlife species need, regardless of what they are or where they are. And that would be food, water, cover, and safety or security. And you can imagine that depending on the species we're talking about, that these requirements vary pretty drastically, even among the species that are up here on the screen, which is why before we prescribe any sort of management activity, it's important to set goals and figure out what your target species is, because depending on what species you want to improve habitat for, it can pretty drastically alter what you would be doing. So just keep that in the back of your mind whenever you're thinking about doing any sort of habitat improvements. When it comes to white-tailed deer, we'll get into a little bit of ecology about them. First and foremost, whitetails are browsers, which in essence means that they're actually pretty picky eaters. Now that doesn't mean that there's a limited amount of plants they'll eat. They actually have an incredibly varied diet, literally hundreds of plants. However, they are picky about what they eat and when, and that usually has to do with the nutrient content of the plants at the time. They also prefer early successional habitat, and a big part of that reason is because in early successional habitat, most everything is within their reach to eat, and it also provides a better sense of security. I've also noticed that they tend to prefer ecotones or edge cover. Anytime you have two different habitat types coming together, whitetails love traveling along the edge of that transition area. So let's dive into those requirements as they relate specifically to deer. What a whitetail eats varies pretty drastically over the course of a year, as you can imagine, as we go through seasons. So in spring and summer, does are lactating and raising fawns, bucks are growing their antlers, and both of these activities requires a lot of protein. And luckily for deer, this is the time of year where most everything is green. There's a lot of high protein, high moisture, succulent plants, forbs and browse growing out on the landscape. And then once we get into fall, it's all about preparing to get through winter. Deer are putting on the feed bag and trying to pack on as many pounds and as much fat as they can before winter sets in. And this involves trying to consume a lot of protein, fat, and carbs. And then during winter, the whole game is about survival. And at that point, browse is king. Overall, nutritionally during the winter, the quality of nutrition is pretty poor. At that point, whitetails are basically just browsing on twigs and shrubs, essentially just to keep calories going in. As long as they can ingest enough calories to stave off, oh my God, edit this out because I can't think of my words, stave off starvation. That's essentially the goal throughout the winter months. And then the cycle just repeats as it goes on. In terms of water, this is really the hardest part for managers to control, because if you don't have water on your land already, it's typically not very cost efficient or very easy to get water there. This typically involves doing some sort of a pond creation, which gets very expensive. Whitetails in general, they require roughly 4 liters a day of water. And during the growing season especially, they get a lot of this water from the plants that they're eating, because it's such high moisture plant material at that time. And in my opinion, water should be the last management consideration if you're looking to improve your habitat for whitetails, just because they can get it from so many places and it's typically not very feasible for a manager to install, short of spending a lot of time and money on it. So for cover, no surprise to anybody that's ever deer hunted, but deer love thick cover. Generally, the thicker the better, although it can get too thick. But what they're looking for is this sense of security. Deer love the feeling that they can't be seen. So typically they'll look to bed down in areas that provide fairly dense cover, but somewhere where the deer can still either see or smell predators coming from a distance. And they also prefer edge habitat, like I mentioned before. And they love to travel along edge habitat. They love to bed just off of edge habitat. They're a very predictable animal in the places that they will gravitate towards. When we're thinking about safety, deer are a prey animal, and humans are their biggest predator by far in this day and age. So they will go out of their way to look for places that are either free of human intrusion or that have very low levels of human intrusion. And these are usually areas that people just don't go, whether they're tough to get to, like a swamp with water that you'd have to cross, or remote areas, you know, maybe a mountaintop if you're in a different part of the country, or if you're in northern Minnesota, in the middle of a 1,000-acre block of woods with no roads through it. And in my opinion, this is the easiest aspect for a landowner to control, because you directly control where and when you're out and about in your woods. And if you're looking to keep areas of your property that deer view as a safe haven, it's a good idea, at least for most of the year, to try to stay out of those spots. So this is something that we directly have in our control if you're a property owner. Okay, so now we went through basically what whitetails need and what they like. But okay, that doesn't answer how do we do that through management? And for that, I'm going to use every biologist everywhere's favorite answer to that question, and it depends. And the reason I say that is because there's no two properties that are exactly the same. Depending on the cover on the property, there are some generalities that apply, but that doesn't mean you would apply them the same across properties. And I think more so than, well, what should I do, is think about what your limiting factor is. Out of those 4 things that wildlife require, and out of those 4 things when it pertains to whitetails particularly, what do you have the least of? So for instance, if you have a lack of available browse, maybe that's what you need to target. Or if you lack thick cover, maybe that's something you need to target. And as we get into the management activities here, the nice thing is that a lot of these activities, when it pertains to woodland management, they can actually accomplish multiple goals with the same practice. So first and foremost, one of my favorite activities with mature woods is trying to create pockets. And you do this by thinning or clear cutting these small little pockets. And to me, the size of each pocket really depends on how big your property is. For instance, if you only own 40 acres, you don't want to be clearing a bunch of 5-acre pockets, because you're going to run out of mature woods real fast. Now, if you have 500 acres, on the other hand, that's a little more feasible to do a little larger cuts, but typically just base them around the property size. And I really like to do what's illustrated in this picture here. As you can imagine, how much more edge is created just looking at these pockets within the woodland. And it also creates this patchwork network. And it's really easy for me to visualize, seeing this picture, how deer would almost travel circularly through this, just going from pocket to pocket as they're bedding and browsing. This is really an ideal scenario for deer habitat right here. And it also has literally tons of foraging value. Forest succession in its earliest stages just puts up huge amounts of fresh growth. And this is the kind of thing that deer really gravitate towards from a food perspective, both during spring and summer and throughout spring and summer, and come fall and winter. This is when they rely on some of that in order for them to survive the winter. So this is just another example of how you could create different pockets across your property, giving them a little bit of contour too, just to encourage deer to use them more. So this here is a property that I was just on a week or two ago now, and this landowner had a stand of oaks that was actually over dense, which I don't see very often in Minnesota, but this landowner had a stand of bur oaks that was overly dense. So he decided that he was going to go ahead and thin those out, essentially leaving certain trees, or the healthiest trees. And then this was done last November. So this was roughly 8-9 months ago. And this is what it looked like after only about 2 or 3 months of growth. So you can see there'd be a tremendous food value to whitetails in this area. And this is just after a couple of months, and it's been a dry year. So this project, this was actually aspen removal. It was mostly a stand of mature aspen with a few mature oaks intermixed. So what we did was we harvested all the aspen and we left the oaks standing. And this is the second year of that project. So we did it in the winter of 2019, 2020. And then this is what it looked like a few weeks ago in early June. So now it's starting to get to that thick point where deer will really gravitate towards that. This is something they use both for food and bedding, because now the vegetation is tall enough that it gives them that sense of security, in addition to being a great food resource for them. So ultimately, this is what we're shooting for, right? We want that open area when it's young, that young matrix that deer love to browse in. And then as it matures, we're looking for the area to get nice and dense and thick, somewhere where a deer would feel comfortable laying down all day. Another thing that I like to do in certain woodlands is removing undesirable understory. I have to put this out there because I hear a lot of deer hunters say that they like buckthorn because it makes things thick, but I have to go out and say that buckthorn is poor habitat for all wildlife. And I can see why people think it looks good in the beginning of the infestation, because it looks kind of thick, but not too thick. But once it's fully established, it literally just takes over the woodland, and it really starts to have some negative effects in terms of the ability of native vegetation to even exist. And deer really don't browse on it at all. So it's not even beneficial for them in that regard. I've been on a couple properties that it's fully taken over, and deer use on those properties is actually fairly minimal. They will walk on established trails, and that's about it, because it's so thick you can't even get off of the trails. So I encourage landowners at all costs to keep buckthorn out, or to remove it and try to control it as best you can, because it does have a lot of negative outcomes. So this one is what's illustrated in the picture here. Ironwood is a native species, but it really doesn't have much value for wildlife. It tends to grow fairly dense, and it's mostly an understory tree, and it has a bad tendency to shade out the ground layer. In the picture here, there's a fair bit of ground cover left, but I've seen plenty of woodlands in the summer with a heavy ironwood component where the ground is mostly bare throughout the entire growing season. So this is where I'd like to go in and remove some of that ironwood, because even though you have overstory trees, you did just let a fairly significant percentage of sunlight down to the ground, even by just removing that ironwood. There's enough sunlight getting through to promote forb growth on the forest floor. In certain cases, I even like to go in and remove maple and basswood saplings, because even though these trees have pretty good value for wildlife like songbirds, maples especially have a tendency to grow really dense in the understory, and both from a timber production standpoint and a white-tailed deer habitat standpoint, they just cast too much shade in some cases. So I like to go in and thin some of that as well, depending on the circumstances. And the reason I like doing some of this understory removal, University of Tennessee researchers found that even as little as 30% canopy cover reduction created an additional 750 pounds an acre of deer forage. So you really don't need all that much sunlight hitting the ground for the woods to provide deer with a lot more food than they had before. So edge feathering is another thing that I've started using a lot in the last 5 years. And essentially, the goal of edge feathering is to create this sort of soft transition between two cover types. And this can be done just about anywhere where there's an edge, whether that's, something that was just harvested, you have a logger push all the treetops and the slash up against the edge of the cut. I've done it along the edges of food plots, whether you're hinge cutting things or you're just piling brush up. I've also done it on the edges of mature woods where it comes to a point where it's mature woods and grassland. You can edge feather that. So the purpose is just to put a little more browse down, create a little more of a soft transition, and it also provides side cover. I've noticed that deer seem to feel very safe traveling along areas that have been edge feathered just because it seems thick to them. And I think their line of thinking, if they have that kind of conscious thought, is that they can hop right in if at any point they sense danger. So crop tree release is something that I've become a really big fan of in the last few years. I never really realized the true benefits of it until fairly recently, but it's something that I've become a huge proponent of lately, and especially when it comes to oaks. There's a lot of areas, especially in Minnesota here, where we have a pretty healthy oak component, and this can really set them free, so to speak. The same University of Tennessee researchers found that by releasing healthy mature oak trees, it can increase acorn production up to 65%, which especially, and this just isn't just for deer, there's a lot of wildlife species that rely on acorns to pack on fat for the winter. So not only is this great for deer, but really it's great for all your wildlife. The picture here shows different types of crop tree release. And this just depends on what's growing around it. So I don't know that I've ever used a one-side release because I don't feel like the benefit is worth the effort. But say you were doing a two-side release, the reason you might do that is because maybe on that left side of that green tree there, those are also oaks and you don't necessarily want to remove them. So that can still have benefit, but really I prefer doing full 3-side release or 4-side release. It really allows that tree canopy to spread out, to take advantage of the available resources, and it really improves that acorn production. And the side benefit of that too, it also improves timber quality. There have been a lot of studies that have shown that average diameter at breast height, which is essentially how much wood is in the tree, it actually increases quite drastically compared to before that tree was released. So just a side benefit for, maybe down the line if you're looking to harvest some of those oaks. The other thing it does is it opens up the canopy. Anywhere around these green trees where you removed, that's a lot of sunlight hitting the ground now that wasn't before. And like I mentioned in a few slides ago, that's a lot of deer food being put on the ground. So this is kind of a visual representation of what it would look like if you were doing like a full 4-sided crop tree release from the ground. You want that tree to really be able to spread those canopy limbs. That's where you're going to really see those trees able to take advantage of the new space that was created for them. Another thing I wanted to talk about is thermal cover. And this is especially important from where I'm at in central Minnesota and points north, especially as you get way into northern Minnesota because the winters tend to be so much worse. And these are typically stands of conifers, red pine and white pine, spruce. These are really common examples of thermal cover. And as you keep moving north, this can really make or break winter survival for the deer herd. And the reason that it is so important is because when conifers start to mature, being that they keep their needles, researchers, it was actually in northern Minnesota, found that as winter sets in, these pine limbs hold snow so much better than deciduous trees, to the point where the snow depth is actually less under the conifer stands than it is in open areas or hardwood stands. So this obviously makes it way easier for deer to travel. And if you remember back to when we were talking food, when they're relying on low calorie browse during the winter months, they need to save every calorie they can. So if they have easier travel, they're burning fewer calories, which makes them better able to get through winter. The other thing that the conifer thermal cover does, it actually holds heat down to the ground level better. Now, it's not drastically noticeable for us, but they've shown that stands of conifer thermal cover are typically a couple degrees warmer than open areas or hardwood stands. And again, it's not much, but when you need every calorie you can, a few degrees warmer makes a big difference in how many calories you're burning over the course of the winter. And I know there are a lot of foresters that are probably grinding their teeth when they see this, but there's no denying that conifer thermal cover is a good source of browse for deer during the winter months, particularly the white cedar swamps of northern Minnesota. That's why you tend to see deer yarding up in those, because of the thermal cover benefits and the food benefits. And in some areas, it's really all they have to go on in the winter. So something else to think about if you have open areas on your property or grassland, I've become a big fan of finding old expired CRP land, typically fields of smooth brome like this, and reforesting them by planting native shrubs and hardwoods. And it takes a few years, but over time, this becomes fantastic cover and browse for deer. So this here is an example that actually was just planted this spring. This is on my family's property. And what you're seeing there, those blue tubes are all northern red oak. You can see in the background, multiple times my uncle tried to establish conifers on this site, and it's kind of up on a small glacial moraine, and it's very sandy, fairly gravelly, and the pines just wouldn't take. You can see a few Scotch pine in the background there that lived, few younger red pine in front of those. So I decided to essentially take a deep dive, figure out what the soils look like there, and try to find species that could adapt and survive on this site. So in those blue tubes, that's all northern red oak, and they're spaced roughly 15 to 20 feet apart. But what you can't see in this picture is that in between all those oaks, there's about 5 or 6 different species of native shrubs planted, and they're spaced somewhere around 8 feet apart. Now, up on the high part of the moraine, I planted things like American plum and serviceberry. And as it started getting down the slope towards the lower ground, I would plant things like nannyberry and chokecherry, and then a little bit of gray dogwood interspersed in there. And then down in the lower parts, I planted red osier dogwood just because the soil's heavier down there. And this is an area that it's going to take about 4 or 5 years. But by that point in time, this is going to be fantastic deer cover. And it has the benefit of also providing them with browse, which will be important through those winter months. The other thing to note is that smooth brome is fairly poor wildlife habitat overall. It has some nesting value for songbirds, but other than that, it tends to just be a monoculture of fairly short grass. And the area that this was planted into historically would have been hardwoods. So it's kind of a double benefit in that we can return the area to what it once was and also benefit deer with a nice little chunk of habitat in the meantime. I debated whether to put anything in here about food plots at all, but I know they're really, really popular, so I figured I ought to at least mention them. And there's no doubt they are extremely attractive to deer. You know, it seems like everybody these days has food plots, and there's no denying the drawing power they have. And they can supplement nutrition and forage, particularly in late fall and through the winter months. I've noticed that since we started using food plots on my family's property, we tend to see less winter kill. Deer go into winter fatter and happier. They have better nutrition throughout the winter. And it's kind of just this chain effect where the benefits add up year after year to where the deer just get healthier and healthier. So they definitely do have benefit in increasing herd health, but I cannot stress this enough. Food plots do not replace native browse and forage. There have been a lot of studies done in heavily agricultural areas, and they found time and again that even in areas with a heavy ag component, the vast majority of a deer's diet still consists of native browse and forage. You cannot replace it. They're going to eat it either way. And one thing I've noticed is that a lot of hunters that I talk to seem to think that if a little bit of food plots is good, a lot of food plots must be great. So if 1 acre is good, well, 10 acres must be way better. And I would disagree with that because this is one component out of those 4 things that deer need. You know, food plots are not providing water, they're not providing cover, and they're not providing that sense of security. So you're really only filling 1 out of the 4 needs that deer have with these food plots. And what I have found to be kind of the preferred way to think about it, I don't think about it in terms of, well, how many food plots should I have, or how big should my food plots be? How many acres should I have? I like to think about it in terms of percentage, because what I found, the sort of sweet spot seems to be about 5% of your acreage in food plots. If you get about that 5%, that seems to be a good balance where you're providing deer with supplemental nutrition, additional forage, and you still have plenty of room to provide them with the native browse that they want and need, and the cover and the security that they're shooting for. So that's what I like to shoot for when I'm designing food plots. And this is a picture of that same food plot in early September. So you can see there's a lot of lush green forage there. And that is an important resource as we get deeper into fall and winter. But just keep in mind that this is still only one component out of what the deer need. So that's about all I've got. I've got a list of websites here, and these are all just fantastic resources for managing for deer habitat. The National Deer Association, you want to know about white-tailed deer, you can probably find it there. The U of M extension page has just tremendous resources for managing habitat, whether it's forests, whether it's grasslands. Great resource there. Minnesota DNR website has a lot of good information about the history of deer in Minnesota, and also current management, hunting seasons, things like that. And then these last 2, Mississippi State University Extension and University of Missouri Extension, they take some really deep dives on how to manage land for deer, different ways you can go about it. So all of these I highly recommend taking a look at if you're interested in deer and habitat management for deer. And if you want to know more, these are the places I would recommend you go. So that's all I've got. Looking forward to taking any questions when we have the Q&A session in a few weeks here. Hope you all enjoyed, and thanks for tuning in.